How are you guys doing? All right. It is so beautiful to have the energy and the movement of these bright young people in our worship service this morning. You think we need some more dance in our Sunday services? Yeah. But outside of this place, it's been a little rough. There have been some high points. But overall, it's been a tough time out there. Really tough time. I'm worried for our country. I'm worried for men and women and boys and girls of color, especially Black people living under the burden of racism, experiencing racism daily in ways that are often invisible to white people. I'm worried for women, all women, as we hear threats in the public square to block access to contraception and block women's ability to make the most private health care decisions for themselves. I'm worried for transgender people who continue to be harassed and targeted with so-called bathroom bills and with violence. I'm worried for children, especially in New Mexico, where we are 50th in the nation for child hunger, and where poor families pay a higher percentage of their incomes in state and local taxes than wealthy families do. Poor people in New Mexico pay nearly 11% of their income in state and local taxes, while the wealthiest New Mexicans pay less than 6% of their incomes. God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, they were created. In this church, we don't often take the Bible literally, but we know to take it seriously. We receive the wisdom of our ancestors, and here their question is crystal clear. Who would you allow to go hungry if you knew they contained within them the very image of God? I'm worried about what this means for all of us, because what touches one affects us all. I started with a reflection on the scriptures for our reading this morning because many people claiming the mantle of Christianity are the same ones pushing for policies that hurt people who are already hurting and diminish their ability to advocate for themselves. As the Reverend Dr. William Barber II said in his speech at the Democratic National Convention on Thursday, they talk a lot about those things God says little, and little about those things God says a lot. I had the good fortune to attend a day-long workshop with Reverend Barber here in Albuquerque a few weeks ago. Kathy McGill was there too, and David, who's back in the booth, and one of our board members, Martha Cattell, and a couple of other members of this congregation. For those of you who weren't there, we are forming a couple of discussion groups around his book, The Third Reconstruction, and after the service today, you could sign up for that in the social hall if you'd like. Dr. Barber pointed out what other Bible scholars have also noticed, that the Bible has more than 2,000 verses regarding poverty, but only about 5 regarding homosexuality, and none about abortion. Many legislators in our country are sworn in with one hand on the Bible, but a lot of the time you have to wonder if they have ever cracked that thing open. How did this happen? How did Christianity in America get cut off from concern for the poor? How did it come to be associated with cutting programs to the poor and with a belief that power and success are signs of God's favor? Kevin Cruz is a historian at Princeton. In a book published last year, he shed some light on the answer to that question, and it may surprise you. In the years after the Great Depression, the American public held corporations responsible for the suffering they had been through. Businesses had made huge gains in the Roaring '20s to the tune of 65% due to the mechanization of manufacturing. But the average employee's salary had increased only 8%. Soon, the top 0.1% of society made the same income as the bottom 42% combined. And personal debt was growing out of control. Sound familiar? It was unsustainable, and the market crashed. President Herbert Hoover assured the people it would only last a couple of months. And he tried to address it through a trickle-down plan in which he did not extend aid to poor and hungry Americans, but met with CEOs instead to offer them support. Didn't work. When President Theodore Roosevelt was elected by a landslide to replace Hoover, Roosevelt ushered in the New Deal. Now, he was a devout man who quoted scriptures so often that his speeches were called sermons. His faith informed the New Deal, in which the government programs were established that would get people back to work and provide food to those who were going hungry. Well, the big corporations did not take well to being blamed for the Great Depression, nor did they like these costly new government programs. At the annual gathering of the National Association of Manufacturers in New York in 1940, they wondered what to do. After days of listening to bigwigs from General Motors, Sears Roebuck, and General Electric, they were surprised and delighted by one more speaker, of whom most of them had never heard, James Fifield, Jr., the pastor of a wealthy congregation in Los Angeles. Fifield had developed a theology that was pleasing to the millionaires in his pews back home, and now he shared it with the convention. Dismissing passages about wealth and poverty, Fifield told the convention that worldly success was a sign of God's favor. The flip side of this theology, of course, is that if you are poor, you must deserve it for some reason. Then Fifield told the crowd that if they wanted to change public opinion, they needed clergymen on their side. A poll around that time had shown that while corporations were deeply distrusted, ministers were the most trusted people in society. The convention had found its way forward. They funded a massive PR campaign targeting ministers across the country with conferences and cash prizes to those who delivered the best sermons on this new message. Soon, the wealthy association was devoting half of its income to the cause, and it worked. More than 10,000 ministers got on board, preaching that welfare programs and government regulation were an assault on freedom. Their rallying cry was freedom under God. They lifted quotes from the Declaration of Independence. That slogan caught on, and eventually sympathetic elected officials incorporated it into government. Cruz writes, in 1953, the first ever national prayer breakfast was convened on the theme of government under God. In 1954, the previously secular Pledge of Allegiance was amended to include the phrase, under God, for the first time, too. A similar slogan, "In God We Trust," spread just as quickly. Congress added it to stamps in 1954, to paper money in 1955, and in 1956, the phrase became the nation's first official motto. Since then, religious conservatives, so-called, have pointed back to those practices as evidence that our government is fundamentally God-focused, and to argue against secularism as proof that we have lost our way. You gotta laugh or you'll cry, Jane. Religion has been used for selfish, greedy, and even violent aims before, of course. It was used to justify genocide against Native Americans. Slave owners quoted passages from Scripture to try to convince the slave that his or her lifetime of unspeakable suffering was pleasing to God. But it is telling that slaves were prohibited from learning to read it for themselves. In his autobiography, Frederick Douglass tells the story of how he was shipped off as an adolescent to serve a young white couple. And the wife took to him initially, and she started to teach him to read the New Testament. But they hadn't gotten very far when her husband caught wind of it. And he reprimanded her sternly right in front of young Frederick Douglass, saying that if any slave reads the Scriptures, he will become unmanageable and miserable, and basically there will be no turning back. Douglass says nothing could have convinced him better than the man's diatribe that he must finish learning to read. For the man would not have been so upset by it if there weren't something in it that threatened his own power. Today, religion is again being used for discrimination, and claims about freedom are being made. Laws that give religious people or their businesses the power to discriminate against whoever they want are called RFRAs, RFRAs, short for Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Restrictions on voting are being pushed through under the banner of states' rights, but they aren't really about freedom. 2 RFRA laws were attempted here in New Mexico this year in the legislature. Both exempted hospital personnel from assisting with the termination of a pregnancy if it's against their beliefs, and neither one had any clause whatsoever for the life and health of the mother. It wouldn't have mattered if the procedure was a matter of life and death, or whether another clinician was available, or even whether there was another hospital in the area, which, if you live in rural New Mexico, is a pretty big if. This is freedom. And this week, a federal appeals court struck down North Carolina's voter ID law, stating that it was not only discriminatory, it was intended to be discriminatory. The court discovered that the North Carolina legislature had requested data on the use by race of a number of voting practices, and then, data in hand, enacted legislation that restricted voting and registration in 5 different ways, all of which disproportionately affected African Americans. The court said it was done with surgical precision. The voter ID requirement was one of them. Voter ID laws have been enacted in 33 states. It's like there's some kind of backlash happening. Barber looks to history for some context around this moment. He says that we are in the adolescent stage of a third Reconstruction, and that the attacks are a sign of our strength. By our, he means people of faith and their allies who are out to empower voters, dismantle racism, end poverty, house the homeless, strengthen public education, secure civil rights for all, and ensure that all people have access to health care. What does he mean by the Third Reconstruction? He's referring to those times in the past when a share of power was redistributed from the hands of privileged whites, especially men, and claimed by poor people and people of color. The first Reconstruction occurred in the 1860s after slavery was abolished. Black people and white people were elected and worked together in state legislatures. They rewrote constitutions. Laws were written guaranteeing free public education, raising taxes to compensate former slaves, and letting elections be decided by popular vote. There were even legislatures in the South, Barber says, that were majority black or majority black and white coalition. I bet many of us in this room didn't know that. I didn't. But former slave owners resented this shift in power, this loss of power for them. They hated to see poor whites working alongside blacks for the common good. In 1872, the KKK formed and a so-called redemption movement began. It was actually a deconstruction. It took apart what people had begun to build. Voting rights were limited with a poll tax, a literacy test, and grandfather clauses, which rather than grandfathering people in, actually grandfathered them out by denying the vote to anyone whose grandfather had not been eligible. Proponents of these laws said that they weren't racist because any black person who met the criteria, who could pay the poll tax, pass the literacy test, and prove that their grandfather could have voted, would have been eligible to vote. Does this sound kind of familiar? Today, voting is limited by the days and hours that polling places are open, the distance people have to travel, registration policies, and voter ID laws. New rules, similar impact. The mantra during deconstruction, Dr. Barber says, was to take America back again. The second Reconstruction occurred during the Civil Rights era, when Social Security was expanded to agrarian and domestic workers, voting rights were resecured, schools were integrated, there was a war on poverty, and there were fusion coalitions of blacks, Latinos, Latinas, whites, and others, all pushing these things forward together. This time, the deconstruction that followed was called the Southern Strategy. And it didn't look on its surface like it was about race, Barber says, because Jim Crow went to law school and became James Crow Esquire. It used code words like entitlement reform, states' rights, and big government. It focused on, quote, cracking down on crime through laws that actually had the effect of punishing people of color more harshly than whites, often with the result that if they got out of jail, they could no longer vote, go to school, or find a job due to their criminal record. The effect was, and still is, a lot like Jim Crow. The mantra of the Southern strategy: take back America. Ronald Reagan made the Southern strategy a national strategy. We have forgotten the origin of these code phrases: states' rights, entitlement reform. Only recently has there been a national conversation about mass incarceration and racism. But the election of the country's first black president in 2008, the rise of Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter, the enthusiasm of people feeling the burn for a socialist candidate, and now the selection of the first female nominee for a major political party reveal that a third Reconstruction is taking place. Those who have hoarded more than their share of power and have abused it know that their days are numbered and the hour is late. They are fighting back. Their backlash, Barber says, is a sign of our strength. Churches like ours, meaning people like you, have an important job right now. Not only keeping our eyes and ears open, not only learning what we can and doing what we can, we are people of faith. We're people who have a faith in the inherent worth and dignity of all people, the ancient truth conveyed by our visionary, if imperfect, ancestors in the scriptures. And we are the people who must reclaim that moral language. Our ancestors also grappled with this task. They faced people who claimed to be religious but had hardened their hearts to their neighbors. In the Gospel of Matthew, it is written, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity." We've got this special legislative session coming up, and it is a situation that calls for a moral interpretation of what is happening. We are in an immoral cycle right now. The cycle seems to go like this. Tax cuts go to corporations under the idea that they will create jobs. Tax cuts lead to budget shortfalls, which lead to cuts in education, Medicaid, mental health resources, and other programs crucial to the health and well-being of New Mexicans. This leads to higher crime, a less educated workforce, and worse quality of life. With those problems come fewer jobs and a slow economy, which leads to more tax cuts for corporations, and around we go. This was all exacerbated by an over-reliance on revenue from oil and natural gas, which lost value last year. To balance the budget, New Mexico already chose to protect tax cuts and cut budgets for health care and education. What will we do in this special session now? That may depend on who's paying attention, who's offered a platform to share their story, and who is standing behind them when they do. It's up to us to reclaim the moral story and to remind our lawmakers about the moral language of the New Mexico Constitution, too, which says, and I quote, "All government of right originates with the people, is founded upon their will, and is instituted solely for their good." It says, "All persons are born equally free and have certain natural, inherent, and inalienable rights, among which are the rights of enjoying life and liberty, of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and of seeking and obtaining safety and happiness." That's not our Constitution. At the workshop, Barber talked about the power of a fusion coalition, a diverse group of churches, organizations, and individuals, including those who might seem like unlikely allies. He spoke of the importance of creating a platform for people who are negatively impacted by current policies, to speak with their own voices, to tell their own stories. He said the usual leaders and advocates for these movements will often have to step aside. There was a lot of energy and enthusiasm in the room as he spoke. But what there wasn't much of is racial diversity. The group that day was largely white. At the end of the day, a woman who identifies as a queer Latina stood up and pointed out the situation, asking how we would address the problem. Heads nodded and people applauded. But later, when I was invited to a steering committee meeting to figure out how to go forward from Barbara's workshop, I noticed that I already knew all of the people on the email list and that they are all white. When I arrived, I mentioned that I had texted the Latina leader who had spoken up, inviting her to join us, and I got reprimanded, sternly and at length. I was told that we do not have time for diversity, that bringing other voices to the table would derail the conversation, and that young leaders are especially problematic because they did not experience the civil rights movement. I'm 39. I did not live through the civil rights movement, and I certainly could tell that I was derailing the conversation because the major decisions, including who was invited, had already been made. I'm looking for a new group. What happened at that workshop and at that meeting afterward were so revealing of the fact that there is a lot of work to be done in New Mexico, a lot of relationship building to be done. And those of us who are white, who identify as white, have to practice humility. We still have a lot of learning to do. One thing I've noticed about white, socially progressive people is that we don't just care about others, we care about caring. Yeah? Our identity is staked in it. And because our identity is staked in it, the downside is that sometimes we resist hearing when we have been racist. It can be devastating to our sense of self. But that's an ego problem. We got to get our egos out of the way and open our hearts and our intellects to growth and to new relationships. To be really powerful and to truly work for the good of the people of New Mexico, we need a coalition. And to authentically represent the interests of the people of this beautiful state, that coalition has got to be diverse. It has to understand and speak to the ways that issues intersect. How when we say 30% of children in New Mexico live in poverty, we also have to notice that the poor are disproportionately people of color, which means it is an expression of systemic racism. And we have to notice that a high number of poor families are woman-led households, and so gender inequality is at play, and reproductive health care is essential to empower those women as authors of their own lives. And poor kids are less likely to graduate from high school and more likely to get sick, so there are educational and health intersections. We have to notice how it all fits together. We have to get together to notice how it fits together. I ask the older generation, could it be that you're being called to step up again, one more time, and to stand behind and to stand with the younger generation and people who haven't been heard? Could it be that what came before was all a part of a path that led to this moment now? That you were born for this time? And younger folks, could it be that we are the ones we're looking for? That we are the leaders and the allies and the moral advocates who will take back moral language and who will reveal the whitewashed tombs and call out what is full of death and what is the path to living and to life and to justice? William Barber is coming back to New Mexico on Monday, October 17th in the evening. He's bringing Sister Simone Campbell and the Reverends Tracy Blackman and James Forbes, heavy hitters all, inspiring speakers. What will it look like? Who will attend? Will you go? And if so, who will you invite? I'm going, and I'm going to invite friends. Some I already know, and some I haven't met yet, but I plan to on my way to discovering that new group I'm looking for. In his beautiful book, Between the World and Me, the African-American journalist and educator Ta-Nehisi Coates is honest with his son about the harsh realities of the America into which he has been born. He doesn't offer him false comfort, but he quotes his grandmother saying, "You have to find a way to live in the all of it." We have to find a way to live in the all of it, in the way people and issues are interconnected, in the wounds and broken places, in our shortcomings and in the joy of growth and meaningful relationships, in the beauty that exists now, and in the tremendous possibility waiting to be born.